We learned judgment. Abraham we learned salvation, which is Jacob we learned sanctification, and through Joseph we're learning providence. Right. There's going to be a second point to that providence that I'll show you tonight. But Joseph's story is one that gets, as we said, misunderstood a lot of times. You have several chapters of Joseph who is suffering like crazy, even though he did nothing wrong, right? That's not to say he wasn't a sinner. He was a sinner. All have sinned. He's a child of Adam. He's a sinner. But there's no sin listed for him, and nothing that happens to him is given as a direct result of a bad decision he made or of a sin he committed. He is suffering, we would say, unjustly. So he's suffering even though he did nothing wrong. And we see him sold by his brothers. We see him betrayed by Potiphar's wife. We see him thrown in prison. We see him forgotten in prison. And then we see Joseph exalted. He comes out of prison. He interprets the dream. Pharaoh makes him the number 2 guy in prison. But it's important that you understand that just like he didn't do anything to earn his suffering, he also didn't do anything to earn his exaltation. He wasn't suffering because of something he did bad, and he wasn't being exalted because of something he did right. That's the way we want to play that card sometimes. That shows you how much the prosperity gospel is kind of snuck into our thinking, that we think if bad things happen, it must be because I did something wrong. And if I get blessed in some temporal, earthly way, if I get a promotion or money comes my way or something along those lines, well, it must be a reward from God because I did something right. And both of those are the wrong way to think about it. What we're talking about here is the providence of God, God who is at work at all times and in all ways, and oftentimes in ways that you cannot comprehend or understand. You would never guess it. If God were to set you down and say, I'm doing something, do you want to guess what it is? You would never guess it. You wouldn't know what he was doing. And you see that here. We know, because we've read the story of Genesis, that God is saving Judah. Because through Judah will come Jesus, who will save us all. God knows, but they didn't. There's a famine coming. God knew, but they didn't. It would last 7 years. God knows what's on the horizon. They didn't. And all of this time with Joseph, it's been according to the sovereign prerogative of God. He had to get Joseph into Egypt. He had to get Joseph into prison. He had to get Joseph into Pharaoh's court. He had to get Joseph where he is so that Joseph could say that's all part of the providence of God. But what we're enjoying now is sort of the payoff, okay? It's sort of the aha moment. And I've shared this with you. I like to call it the aha moment. Very rarely in life will you get the aha moment. Some people do, but most people do not. Job, for example. We know why Job suffered. Anybody familiar with the story of Job? Why did Job suffer? His faith was being tested? Not wrong. What took place that caused Job to suffer? Yeah. That's right. Yeah, Job serves you, yeah, if you bless me like that, I'd serve you too, right? So, we know that. We got to read Job chapter 1. Did Job know that? Job didn't get to read chapter 1. He doesn't know why he's suffering. He doesn't know about this conversation between Satan and God. He doesn't understand what God is doing. At the end of the book of Job, does God come clean and say, oh, by the way, I didn't tell you earlier, but there was this conversation Satan and I had? No. For all we know, Job never knew in this life what took place in the heavenlies. That was something that God was doing under his prerogative for his purposes, and Job was just required to be faithful. Doesn't know what God is doing. And you see this all throughout life. You'll see this in your life. Some of you have already suffered. I can assure you that more suffering will come your way because of the sin-infested rock we live on. But the reality is, God is at work, and many times God does not feel compelled to tell you why or what end he's working to. But what God does do is promise you repeatedly that it's worth it. And I want to start with some of those verses before we get into Genesis 45. Somebody turn and read Romans 8:18. Who's going to do that one? Zach will. Somebody turn and read, where did I just read that? 2 Corinthians 4, 16 to 18. Abigail. 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13. Aaron. And Matthew 5, 10 to 12. I knew you were going to do that. Kiara. 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13. My Sunday school class is the world's worst at that. You are. We'll test it Sunday, and you'll... Matthew 5, 10 to 12. All right, Zach, you got Romans 8:18. Read it loud so the world can hear.
For I
Paul said, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that's coming. Now, I want you to think about Paul for a second. Paul, if you read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says, I know a man who was caught up into the third heaven. And he was allowed to see things, inexpressible things, which man is not permitted to speak. You find out later in the chapter that he's talking about himself. That God called Paul into the heavens to see. You say, what did he see? I don't know. He's not allowed to tell us. But what we do know is that the effect of what he saw was so great and so glorious that to keep him from exalting himself, God actually gave him what is called a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to keep him humble. In other words, all of the suffering and all the trials that Paul walked through, we see those in Scripture. Paul was allowed to go up and see the heavenlies. Implied there is the glory of Christ. Implied there is his eternal reward. Implied there is all the blessings of eternal life in the presence of God. And Paul says it was so good that Paul, and by the way, when you've read the life of Paul, have you ever found a hint of arrogance in Paul? Anything you've ever read from him? You don't find him bragging or boasting about anything. Yet, whatever he saw was so good that even he, in order to keep from boasting, was had to give a thorn in the flesh. And so when Paul makes the statement, listen, I consider that the sufferings of this life are not worthy to be compared, he knows. There's no comparison. What God is doing, though you may not understand it now, someday will be so worth it. It's the reality. Who's got 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, Abigail? Read it loud.
Therefore, we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal.
All right, so Paul said, look, we don't lose heart. Because momentary light affliction, that's the suffering, is producing eternal weight of glory. Momentary, eternal. Light, weight. Affliction, glory. You see how he's making a contrast there. In other words, again, you don't understand what's happening now, but what will make it worth it, the payoff, you'll see that. 1 Peter 4:12-13, that's Aaron.
Beloved, do not be surprised at the fury of ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as through some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exaltation.
All right. You're suffering, fiery trials, keep rejoicing. When he returns at the exaltation of his glory, you also will rejoice. It'll be worth it. Matthew 5:10-12, Kiara.
Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed you are when people insult you and persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
All right, Jesus says, look, if you get maligned and mistreated and persecuted and falsely accused, rejoice. That's the way they treated the prophets. And if that's the way they're treating you on earth, your reward in heaven is great. There's no comparison. Well, you may not see that in this life. In fact, there are plenty of Christians who die as martyrs. God didn't sweep in and save them from death. There are plenty that suffer in this life and suffer their entire life. There are plenty that walk through hardship and trial so long as we're on this earth, on this planet. But there is a payoff, and it's always worth it. Now, Joseph actually got to see at least a glimpse of his aha moment in this life. We don't always get this, but Joseph did. He was able to understand from God why God did this. He's one of the few that gets an explanation of his suffering. But it's encouraging to us because we have an eyewitness testimony of one who we'll all agree suffered terribly. I mean, we can imagine getting sold at 17 years of age by our brothers into a bunch of Midianite traders. We can't imagine getting lied about in the home where we worked as a slave. We can't imagine being thrown in prison and then being forgotten there for 2 years. We can't even imagine how hard that would be, all of his suffering. And yet, Joseph's going to show you how worth it was what God did. So we're just looking at the first 15 verses of Genesis 45 tonight. And let's start. We're going to call it just Joseph's emotion. Somebody read the first 2 verses of Genesis 45.
Joseph.
Y'all don't fight.
Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried. Have everyone go out for me. So that there was no man with him. When Joseph made himself known to his brothers, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it.
All right. What has just happened? I know it's been 2 weeks since we've been here on Wednesday night, but what just happened that caused Joseph to overwhelm with emotion? What? Yeah, but he's been with Benjamin. I mean, they ate a meal. What? Well, he's going to, but he hadn't yet. What has just happened? Judah what? Yeah, Judah showed true repentance. Judah showed a change of heart. Remember that this has all been a test. You remember this? And Carrie and I don't remember what we were doing now. What were we doing? And I was like, we were listening to a sermon going down the road. Steve Lawson, I think we were listening to him. And he said something about on the love chapter, and it just clicked with me. Oh my gosh, why didn't I see this? So, you know, the boys all come back, and they bring Benjamin with them. And when they sit down to eat, you remember what Joseph does for Benjamin? You remember? He gives them all food, but what's he do for Benjamin? 5 times as much. Yeah, he gave him 5 portions. And at the time, it didn't click with me. But you remember, he's fixing to test them, right? Because he's going to stick his cup in Benjamin's sack. And then when they go back, he's going to catch him and be like, nope, this one has to be my slave forever. I think it's interesting that Joseph gave Benjamin 5 portions because that's part of the test. It wasn't so long ago that we saw one of the brothers get preferential treatment and be shown favoritism. And what did all the other brothers do in response to that? Oh yeah, they hated him. We're going to kill him. Let's get rid of him. Joseph, who's setting the trap, is doing the same thing. He shows all this preferential treatment to Benjamin, all this favoritism, because he's trying to relight those old fires. Let's see if anything has changed. Because if I know my brothers, they're going to hate Benjamin for this. And when I trap Benjamin and I say he's going to be a slave, I've already done the dirty work for him. And if my brothers are the same brothers they were, 20 years ago, oh, they're going to leave Benjamin here and they're going to go home and feel like, ta-da, we won. So he sets that trap, remember? And when they come back, Judah, total break from character. Judah, who we say has been redeemed, and we saw that way back with that story of Tamar, which honestly didn't happen that so long ago in the timeline of things. It was just many chapters ago that we read of it, where God showed grace to Judah in a way that he did not deserve. And now you have Judah, who is a brand new man. And he comes up and he's confessing his failure and he's confessing his sin. And he's the one that offers himself on behalf of his brother, right? He offers himself, take me, let my brother go. And what you now see from Joseph, who, by the way, knows he's been sent there because of his brothers, right? When did he figure that out? Do you remember? Remember this? He's already had this moment. When they bowed down to him, right? When they showed up the first time and bowed down, it hits him. I see what's going on. But still, that's not a completed thing because he ran them through tests that time and they failed, right? There wasn't anybody good enough to do it yet. So it's not a completion, although he kind of understands what God has been doing. But now they've come back. He set this next test, and Judah is redeemed. Judah is a different man. And what does Joseph do? Yeah, he breaks into tears. He can't take it, right? He has to make everybody leave. And it says he weeps so loudly that the Egyptians heard it and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. What is this weeping? Yeah, it's rejoicing. These are the tears of, it was worth it, right? God did it. What seemed impossible, could you imagine at 17 years of age when they've thrown Joseph in a well and then they're going to sell him to Midianite traders and it's all Judah's idea to make money off of his brother, that while he's being carried off, that Joseph had any thought whatsoever that Judah could ever be saved? You wouldn't think that, would you? I mean, this guy's as bad as they come. Anybody that would do this guy has as seared of a conscience as you can have. He is as evil as they come. He would break my father's heart. He would sell his own brother. He is not a good man. And the thought that someone like Judah could be saved must have seemed as impossible to Joseph as anything imaginable. And yet now, here he sits in this room and he sees what God has done. And it's that flood of emotion it was so worth it. It was so right. I fully expect, I've told this to so many people who have come in my office, or so many people who have suffered in one way or another, because I don't know why they're suffering. They don't know why they're suffering. It's not for us to know why we're suffering. God just calls for us to trust Him and be faithful, but we don't know. But I've told them, and I fully believe this, that there will come a moment when we are with Christ and we know fully, just as we are fully known, and when we see and are able to comprehend why God has done what He did, and we're able to look back over the course of our life and see the trials we walked through, the hardships, the unjust things that we felt like we endured, the suffering that went on and on and on, I am fully convinced that on that day, we will say, that was perfect. What you did was perfect. I would have never done that. I would have never in a million years seen that to have been the plan. I couldn't even comprehend how anything good could possibly be coming of this. But now that I am with you, and I know fully as I've been fully known, now when I see what you've done, I think Joseph's response, I think that's our response. My gosh, what you've done. Oh, the wisdom of God. I would have never seen this. I would have never comprehended this. What you did was perfect. I am so glad that you were sovereign over that situation. That you didn't just leave it up to me to do what seemed best in my eyes, but that you intervened and took it out of my hands and caused something to occur that I would have never thought of. That's perfect. That's perfect. I'm fully convinced this will happen. Joseph's one of the reasons I am. But you see Joseph's emotion. Well, now let's get into his explanation. Somebody first read verses 3 and 4. This time, Zach, you can read, so you and Aaron don't fight. Okay.
Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, and they were dismayed at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt.
Oh, this is a fun moment. He tells his brothers, I'm Joseph. And the first question is my father still alive? But it says they can't answer because they were dismayed. You've seen that word dismayed from them before. If you turn back to chapter 42. Chapter 42. First you look at verse 28. This is when they found the money had been returned in their sack the first time they went. And in verse 28 of chapter 42, he said to his brothers, my money has been returned, and behold, it's even in my sack. And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? They thought, oh no, God has found us out. God is punishing us. This is bad. Then you look down to verse 35. Now it came about as they were emptying their sacks that, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were what? Dismayed. They are terrified. They are bewildered. They don't know what to do. They are confused. They are scared. They just know that God is angry. Joseph will get them. They're in a world of hurt. And that's the same word here, rightly so. They can't answer because they are dismayed at his presence. And your thought must be, if you're the brothers, we're dead men, right? At best, we're going to be slaves. And then Joseph says something that had to make them feel so much better. He said to his brothers what? No, not yet. Come closer. That's fun. Step up a little closer to me here. So you can see them coming closer, can't you? You see how that's working? The gulp, the pit in their stomach. They kind of make eye contact with one another. They start easing up there real slowly. And he said, I am your brother. Just so you'll know, I'm fully aware of what happened. You remember the one you sold into Egypt? What do you say to that? I mean, they're dead to rights, aren't they? But this is not Joseph trying to humiliate his brothers. This is not Joseph trying to terrify his brothers. Joseph is about to give glory to God for his providence before his brothers. What you're going to see now, we're going to look starting in verse 5 and go through verse 8. And I want to show you 3 benefits of the fact that God is sovereign in providence. You're going to hear this debated, and you hear it all the time. It actually comes through a lot in secular movies. this debate of what is called free will. How many of you have ever heard of free will, right? And people say, I believe in free will. Our world loves the notion of free will. They love the notion that I call all the shots, I believe in free will, and we do what we want. Just to make sure we're clear on it, there is some truth to that. If you do what you want, and you all do, you would say that's me with my free will, right? If I want to walk out the door, I'll walk out the door. That's what the world, says is free will. Here's the problem. While you can do what you want to do, what is not free is your will itself. Your will is enslaved to sin. And so while you do what you want is sin, right? Does that make sense? So yes, in a sense, that's why the world thinks we have free will. It is true that you kind of do what you want, but the reality is you only do what your sinful inclination wants. Your will is not free, even though you freely exercise it. Beyond that, it is such a good thing that we are not in charge of our own destinies. That's what the world wants you to think. We watched a movie, I don't know, on VidAngel not too long ago with Will Smith. I don't even know what the movie was about, or I know it was about, but I don't know what it was called. But Will Smith is basically this guy, and they've got these guys in a room. They all wear Tom Landry hats. You know what are the fedoras? Are those what those are called? Anyway, they all wear like Tom Landry hats. And they are basically with this book, which is the map of everybody's life. And so, they map everything out, and they put everything in order, and you only meet who they want you to meet, and you only, you follow this path and whatnot. And the whole premise of the movie is Will Smith breaking free from that prescribed plan. And so it's a movie all about how some sovereign intellect calling all the shots is a bad thing, and what you really need to do is let the humanity do what they will, do what they want, let them control their own destinies. And that's sort of the glamour thought of the world of Hollywood, is that we're all free, let us control our own destinies. We don't want anybody in charge calling the shots. We don't want some giant game maker up here. They would portray him as moving the pieces around. Let me tell you why you absolutely want God to be sovereign over all things in this life. And what you're going to see from Joseph here are three tremendous benefits of the fact that you don't control your own destiny, that God is sovereign, that he is calling the shots, that he has ordained your days before you, before as yet one of them came into being. And nobody preaches that sermon better than Joseph. And that's what I want you to see here. There's three benefits to God being sovereign. Somebody read verse 5. This is Joseph's sermon to his brothers.
Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because your soul can fear, for God sent me before you to preserve your life.
All right. Now, if Joseph's brothers had this, quote, freedom to control their own destiny, and it really wasn't a divine plan, it just, things ended out good, what do you tell your brothers if you're Joseph? Ha ha, suckers, right? Look what you tried to do, but I overcame. You tried to kill me, but I'm better than you, right? I dominated. I won. Look at me. Ha ha, I'm the winner. You're the loser. I'm smarter. I'm better. You tried, but you failed. I am the champion, right? I mean, if it's all just about humans following their course, doing their best plan, that's what it would be, right? And if it's about free will and man's ingenuity and man's leadership and man calling the shots and man determining his own destiny, just kill those brothers. Right? I mean, there's nothing good there. It was all evil. What's the point? But notice what Joseph says to them. First, don't be grieved. In other words, don't be sad. Don't be sorry. And then, this is remarkable. What does he tell them next? What? No, you keep skipping ahead now. Don't take any words out of the Bible, Zach. What? Don't be angry with yourselves. Really? Don't be angry with yourselves? You would expect a little groveling here, right? You would expect a little beat your breast, right? Shred your clothes, something. Don't be grieved, and don't be mad at yourself. Yeah, the blunder of the century, for sure. Super mistake, you bet. Done with ill motives, sinful at its core, absolutely. But don't be angry with yourselves. Why? Now you're going to be timid and scared. Don't be timid and scared. Be courageous, son. What'd you say? God sent me. You want to know the first benefit to the fact that God is sovereign? Is that you get comfort in your failure. That's a huge benefit. Comfort in your failure. You are not going to succeed at most of what you try in life. That doesn't mean you won't succeed at anything. That doesn't mean things won't go well for you. But by and large, this life is about overcoming failure. That's why I love the game of baseball so much. Baseball is a game of learning to deal with failure. The greatest hitter in the history of the world is Ty Cobb, who had a lifetime batting average of .379. The greatest hitter to ever play the game got out 2 out of every 3 times. It's a game of failure. And life is a game of failure. And you're going to mess up. And if you had the full repercussion of every bad decision you ever made, none of us would make it past the age of about 3, because you would either sugar yourself or poison yourself to death by the time you made it that far. I mean, it's just the way it would happen. You wouldn't make it. When we think about things of infinite more importance like ministry, ministry is a near impossible task. We step up here to preach to youth or to preach to adults with one objective, that we want them to get saved. The problem is you talk to dead souls, right? You can't awaken the dead. We could all go to the cemetery and try to convince somebody to come out from under a tomb, but it just doesn't happen. I mean, unless God does it, right? But who here is actually qualified to lead someone to salvation? Who can preach good enough to make somebody get saved? How many of your friends can you love them good enough to make them get saved? And when you come home at night after witnessing to a friend or talking to somebody about the Lord or inviting somebody to church, they won't come, do you come home sometime and say, man, I didn't do it good enough. I didn't witness good enough. Or that one time I slipped up and I lost my temper and I killed my witness. Or this other time I messed up and I showed them the sin in my life and now they know I'm a failure. And you just constantly say, I don't do any of this good enough. And that's true. If the growth of the kingdom of heaven was based on our ability and success, nobody would get saved. If anything in this life was based on your ability to make it happen, it wouldn't happen. None of us have within ourselves the ability to succeed really at anything. It's a good thing that God is sovereign. It's a good thing that God is ordaining our days, that God is at work to overcome our failures and overcome our weaknesses. And there is tremendous comfort in that. I don't mind stepping into the pulpit and preaching to the best of my ability, even though I know it is not nearly enough, if I know that God in His sovereignty will use it according to His perfect will. There's comfort in adversity. There's comfort in failure if you are believing the sovereignty of God. There's another thing you learn here about God's sovereignty. Somebody read verse 6.
When famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest.
All right. So now Joseph has a piece of news for his brothers. You've had 2 bad years. Guess what? There's 5 more coming. What would you have felt if on January 1st, 2021, you found out there was going to be 6 more years of the pandemic? 6 more years of 6 feet apart social distancing, 6 more years of shelter in place, 6 more years of wear a mask everywhere you go, 6 more years of just the utter nonsense that we were all told to walk through. I didn't make it through 1 month very well, let alone a year, let alone 7 years. This is hard stuff to swallow, right? They make their whole living off of farming, off of plowing, off of planting, off of produce. And they've squeaked by the last 2 years because they've been able to go get some food from Joseph. And that's probably what they're thinking. Let's just go get some food from Joseph and we'll go back home. But now they get some really, really discouraging, disheartening, gut punch, bad news. It's like we're not even halfway done yet. There's 5 more years of this. Not where you're going to plant a crop and it's going to struggle. There's going to be 5 more years where you're not even going to plow. 5 more years where you're not even going to plant. I mean, we're not talking about my tomato plant only put off a few tomatoes. We're not talking about my cotton was bad this year. We're talking about nothing. You're not even going to plow. How are you supposed to deal with news like that in your life? With the understanding that God who is sovereign, knew what was coming before you knew what was coming, and has already been at work for the past however many years to prepare you and to preserve your life, well aware of what was on the way. Isn't that comforting? To know that God is sovereign, that you don't just hear bad news like that and they look at you and say, well, it's up to you. What are you going to do now? Because I'll be honest, I don't know. I mean, we hear it right now. Sometimes it feels a little bit like our world is like we're all in one of those bands on the Titanic that just keeps playing music like everything's wonderful, but it feels like the ship's going down. And you hear people, right now, if you're on social media at all, you see all these, or at least they're on my feed, all these prepper deals, get prepared, how to make a purifier of water in your backyard basement, how to turn your chicken into an electrical source. I mean, all kinds of different stuff that they tell you how to do, because you got to be prepared, because the apocalypse is coming and it's going to be no food, and I don't know, maybe it will. But if I wake up tomorrow and find out that China has hit us with an EMP and there's no more electric grid, and so there's no more water pumps, you're not getting water or electricity or whatever, and then you come to me and say, what do you plan to do? You know what I'm going to tell you? I have no idea, right? I don't know. I'm going to go to the store and get all the toilet paper I can get before anybody else gets there, right? I don't know. I don't have a plan for this, and I promise you, the preppers that are prepping don't have a plan for this. You don't know. But you know what I will do immediately? I will fall down and thank God that He is sovereign, and that while this has caught me off guard, it has not caught Him off guard. And that just as He is prepared for Joseph and his brothers, He has prepared for us. And there is tremendous hope in adversity if God is sovereign. If it's up to you to forge your own destiny, good luck. But if God is sovereign, there's confidence. Look at verse 7. Here's another one.
God sent me before you to preserve for you and to remnant in the earth, to keep you alive by grace.
God sent me to preserve a remnant and to keep you alive with a great deliverance. What's all the focus going on now? Joseph's doing such a great job here. He doesn't have his brothers groveling before him, right? Now then, I have stored up all this food in Egypt. Is there anything that you boys would like to say to me? That's not what he does, is he? God is sovereign. Guys, you wouldn't believe it. You just have no idea what He's been doing. You didn't send me here. God sent me here. He sent me here because there's a famine coming, and guess what He sent me to do? Save you. If God is sovereign, there is gratitude and salvation. There is gratitude and salvation. In spite of their failures, God accomplished a perfect plan to save them from adversity that they didn't even know existed. Think about that. They didn't even know they should have been preparing. Right? They didn't know about this famine coming. They had no clue. They didn't know what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and yet God all along did. God has been preparing. God has been making provision so that God could save them, and the only thing you can do at that point is to stop and thank God for it, right? I mean, that's it. Thank God. Thank you for saving me. This is the problem. If it's all about man's free will, who gets the credit for that? Man does. And that's stupid, because no man ever saved himself. So you understand, Joseph preaches a great sermon about the importance of the sovereignty of God. He says in verse 8, now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. God is in charge. That's a glorious thing. One more thing, Joseph's exhortation. Look at verse 9. Joseph now, for the first time, is going to get into the command mode. Okay, he's fixing to give some commands to his brothers. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here, Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. Now what's the command? What's the command? Yeah, go where? Yeah, and not just tell him I'm alive. Bring him. You go get my father, and you go get your wives, and you go get your kids, and you go get your grandkids. You get all your flocks, and you get everything there that's alive in Canaan, and you load it up, and you bring it back here. And you're going to live in the land of Goshen, and you're going to be with me. Now, what is he asking them to do? Think about now our study of Genesis, and think about what he's asking them to do. What? Yeah, leave the promised land. This is the land God promised to Abraham. And when Abraham tried to leave him, or God just kind of put him right back, don't you dare take a wife from the Canaanites for Isaac, right? This is Jacob who left, but God brought him back. Remember how relieved Jacob is when he comes back to the land after having been with Laban for all those years? This is the land of promise. This is what God has given us. This is our inheritance. This is what Esau despised. And so God counted him under judgment for that, cursed him. And now Joseph is asking his brothers, commanding his brothers, go get my father, load everybody up, leave the land of promise, and come live in Goshen. Now, there's a couple of reasons, really one main one, why they have to come to Goshen, why they have to come to Egypt. And you wouldn't know this yet, but reading it. But God made a promise to Abraham that your descendants would be what? What? Like the sand of the sea, like the stars in the sky, right? And right now you're going to see when they go, there's only like 70 of them that are going to go. Egypt is going to become the incubator. Egypt is where they're going to grow from a family of 70 to a multitude like the sand of the sea. God also told Abraham, you're going to leave the land and live in another land where they're going to mistreat you for 400 years, and then you're going to go back because the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. The people of that land of Canaan have not yet filled up the iniquity of their sin to the point of judgment. And so two things God is going to accomplish by bringing them out of the land. They're going to put them in Egypt, which will be the incubator. They're going to grow into a mighty nation right there under the shelter of Egypt. Even though they're going to become slaves, Egypt's going to serve as a bubble protector for them so that they can grow into a mighty nation. At the same time, God allows the iniquity of the Canaanites to grow so that when they come back and wipe them all out, that is just. But to do that, now we come to a pivotal point where Joseph asks Jacob to do something that would have felt unnatural, that would have felt even wrong, it would have seemed difficult to do, and that is get up, leave the land of promise, and come live in Egypt. The call of Joseph is very simply this: I'm going to have to ask you to trust the plan of God. I'm going to have to ask you to trust God. It is clear that God sent me here. It is clear that there's a famine. It is clear that God placed me in a position to save you from this famine. And it is clear what it is that God desires, and that is for you to come and live here so that I can preserve you as a people, so that I can save you as a people, so that the seed of Abraham will endure, so that we will be saved and delivered. But to do that, I'm going to have to ask you to do what maybe feels unnatural to you, what maybe feels wrong. I'm going to have to ask you to trust me. And this is where the providence of God gets really real to each and every one of our hearts. If we believe that God is sovereign, and if we believe in the providence of God, then we have no excuse for failing to trust him when he tells us to do something. We have no excuse for failing to believe him when he gives us a command. For if God gives us a command and we say, no, I'm not doing that, or God asks us to trust him and we say, no, I will not trust him, what could be a more blatant denial of his sovereignty than that? I'm not going to trust you, and I'm not going to do that because I know you say you've got it all under control, but I just don't believe you do. I don't think you really have it all under control, and so I'm going to hunker down right here, and I'm going to fix this myself. What a foolish, foolish notion. The providence of God and the sovereignty of God demands your faith, demands your trust, demands your obedience. And this is what Joseph is now asking of his family. And now you see why it took such an extreme event. You'd have never got Jacob to leave the land of Canaan if it were not for such an extreme event that God had walked their family through. And so not only do you learn that in Adam sin, and sin brings death, and Noah judgment, God judges sin, and Abraham, God brings justification by grace through faith. And through Jacob, God sanctifies his own. But now through Joseph, you learn the importance of trusting God even when you don't understand what's going on around you. Now think for a second. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. And who did he write it to? The Israelites in the wilderness. And here they've come out of Egypt, and they're wandering and circling in the wilderness. And what is his sermon? Don't sin. It brings death. If you continue in sin, it brings judgment. God will save you by grace through faith. He walks you sometimes through a wilderness for what purpose? To sanctify you. And what do I need you to do, children of Israel, as we circle in the wilderness and prepare to go into a land that you think is full of giants? What do I need you to do? Trust God. See the sermon now? Moses has been all around it. Everything he's preached, even though it's been, quote, Abraham and Jacob, and it's been Joseph, it's really been a sermon to them. And how many of us have said here, especially Jacob's life, and gone, oh man, that's me, right? That's me. Moses is a pretty shrewd preacher. Without calling you out by name or without calling his congregation out by name, he preaches to them exactly where they are in life. That you have a God who has sovereignly ordained and orchestrated every event you find yourself under. And he is doing it for the purpose of saving you and sanctifying you. Now trust him. Obey him. Do what he says. He is sovereign. You are not. Trust him and obey him. You see that story now played out through all of the people that go on through the story of Genesis. You understand why Moses picks the people he picks and tells the story he tells. Because you see sin and judgment and grace and faith and sanctification and providence. That's all God at work. Trust him. I don't know what you face in life now. I don't know what you'll face tomorrow, but I know the answer is that God is sovereign. And if you will trust him, it will be worth it. You have to trust him. It will be worth it. Make sense? Questions or comments? Coda was fighting it hard. Attaboy, Coda. You were. Don't give me that look. I saw the yawn. Quincy, you start us. We were out.